He was digging in his yard when he came across a strange roof and decided to dig it up, thinking it was just a random find. But beneath the ground was an object whose existence was not listed in any official records. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The rain had come without drama at first, steady and persistent. The kind of rain that seemed harmless because it lacked thunder and wind. For 3 days it soaked the neighborhood, saturating the soil until the ground could take no more. By the 4th night, the rain intensified, and water began to move with purpose, flowing downhill, carving shallow paths where none had existed before. When morning finally came, the storm left behind a transformed yard, quiet and deceptively calm, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Marcus Hill stood on the back steps of his house, coffee cooling in his hand, surveying the damage. He was a dark-skinned American in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, practical in both appearance and temperament. He had bought the house 5 years earlier, drawn to the extra space and the sense of separation from the city without truly leaving it behind. The property sat at the edge of a semi-rural subdivision where newer homes blended into older plots that had once been farmland. The backyard sloped gently downward toward a line of trees, beyond which an old drainage creek ran dry most of the year. That morning, the slope no longer looked gentle. Water had carved thin channels through the grass, exposing dark soil beneath. Near the center of the yard, a shallow depression had formed where rainwater still pooled, reflecting the gray sky like dull glass. Marcus noticed immediately that the ground there looked wrong, as if it had sagged slightly inward. He had lived long enough in this house to know the yard's quirks, where water tended to linger and where it usually drained away. This was new. He walked down from the steps, boots sinking slightly into the softened earth. The smell of wet clay filled the air, sharp and metallic. As he circled the low spot, he saw that the grass around it leaned inward, roots exposed in places, as though something beneath the surface had shifted. Closer to the tree line, the soil looked oddly smoothed over, lacking the tangled roots and organic debris that normally resisted erosion. Instead, it appeared uniform, compacted, almost deliberate. Marcus crouched and pressed his palm into the ground. It was firm beneath the top layer, too firm for soil that had been this soaked. He frowned, not with fear, but with the focused irritation of a homeowner already calculating time, effort, and cost. The basement had smelled damp that morning, and though there was no visible water intrusion, he knew what persistent moisture could do over time. Mold did not announce itself politely. It crept in quietly, turning small problems into expensive ones. By mid-morning, he had made his decision. He would dig a drainage trench, nothing elaborate, just enough to redirect water toward the creek line where it belonged. He had done similar work before, the kind of practical labor he trusted more than contractors' promises. He marked out the area with stakes and string, choosing the lowest point of the yard as his starting place. The plan was simple. Dig down, create a gravel-lined channel, and give the water somewhere else to go. The first shovel of earth came up easily. The sod peeled back in heavy, wet sheets, roots clinging stubbornly to the blade. Marcus worked methodically, setting aside the grass to replace later. Beneath it, the soil darkened, rich with moisture. Each scoop made a satisfying sound as it hit the growing pile beside the trench. The rhythm of the work steadied his thoughts, narrowing his attention to the feel of the shovel and the resistance of the ground. As he dug deeper, the soil began to change. The roots thinned out faster than he expected, replaced by dense, uniform clay that clung to the metal blade. It took more effort now, his shoulders tightening as he leaned into each lift. Sweat gathered at his temples despite the cool air. He paused occasionally to scrape mud from the shovel with his boot, noticing how little organic matter appeared in the layers below. It was as if the earth had been packed down intentionally, stripped of its natural variation. After nearly an hour, the trench reached a depth where Marcus expected to encounter rocks, or perhaps remnants of old construction debris. The neighborhood had been built in phases, and it was not uncommon to find buried scraps from earlier developments. Still, when the shovel struck something solid, the sensation was wrong. It was not the sharp jolt of stone, nor the hollow clang of metal. Instead, the impact was dull, flat, and oddly uniform. He froze, then lifted the shovel and struck again, more carefully this time. The sound repeated, a muted thud that carried no vibration through the handle. Marcus knelt and brushed away the loose soil with his gloved hands. Beneath the clay, a flat surface emerged, gray and weathered, with a texture that did not belong underground. He cleared a wider patch, revealing straight lines and a slight angle. Whatever it was not natural. The surface was too even, too deliberate. For a moment, he wondered if he had uncovered an old concrete slab, perhaps the remains of a long-forgotten shed. Yet the angle troubled him. Slabs were flat. This surface sloped gently, disappearing beneath the surrounding earth. Marcus stood and wiped his hands on his jeans, studying the exposed section. The rainwater pooling nearby had begun to drain slowly, seeping toward the trench as intended. But now it flowed over the newly revealed surface instead, running along it as if guided. That, more than anything else, unsettled him. Water followed structure, not chance. He fetched a small hand trowel from the garage and returned, kneeling again to work with more precision. Inch by inch, he freed more of the surface, uncovering what looked unmistakably like overlapping tiles. Their edges were worn but intact, fitted together with care. This was not a slab. This was a roof. The realization settled slowly, accompanied by a tightening in his chest. A roof had no business being here, buried beneath his backyard. Marcus leaned back on his heels, scanning the yard, half expecting some obvious explanation to present itself. There was none. The house stood behind him, solid and familiar. The trees beyond the slope swayed gently, indifferent to his discovery. He returned his attention to the trench, tracing the line of tiles as far as he could see before they vanished into packed earth. The roof angled downward, suggesting depth, space beneath. The thought of emptiness below his feet made him acutely aware of the weight of the ground, of the possibility that it might not be as stable as it appeared. Marcus stood and stepped back, his practical instincts overriding curiosity for the moment. This was no longer a simple drainage project. Whatever lay beneath the yard was substantial, and uncovering it carelessly could be dangerous. He needed to think, to assess, to proceed deliberately. As he gathered his tools, covering the exposed section with a tarp weighed down by bricks, his mind raced through possibilities. An old cellar, perhaps, from a farmhouse that once stood here, a storm shelter, abandoned and forgotten. Each explanation felt insufficient, unable to account for the careful construction he had glimpsed. That evening, as the light faded and the yard settled into shadow, Marcus stood at the window, looking out toward the covered trench. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the air heavy and still. Beneath that quiet surface, something waited, patient and concealed, its presence revealed only by chance and water. He knew he would dig again. Whatever lay buried under his yard was no accident of nature, and ignoring it was no longer an option. The ground had shifted, literally and figuratively, and the life he thought he understood had developed a fault line that ran straight through his own backyard. Sleep did not come easily that night. Marcus lay awake, listening to the distant drip of water from the eaves and the faint settling sounds of the house as it cooled. His mind kept returning to the angled surface beneath the tarp, the unmistakable pattern of tiles where no tiles should exist. He told himself it was likely an old structure, something mundane that would make sense once fully exposed. Still, the image of water flowing neatly along that hidden slope replayed again and again, refusing to be dismissed. At first light, he was back in the yard. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy scent left behind by the storm. The tarp lay exactly as he had left it, weighed down at the corners. For a moment, he stood still, listening, half expecting to hear something beneath the ground, some subtle sign that the earth itself was unsettled. There was nothing. Birds moved through the trees at the edge of the property, and the neighborhood beyond remained quiet, unaware. He pulled the tarp aside and knelt where he had stopped the day before. The exposed tiles were darker now, still wet from the rainwater that had seeped down overnight. Up close, their condition surprised him. The edges were chipped in places, but the material itself was solid, resistant to time in a way ordinary roofing rarely was. The seams between them were filled with a hardened substance, not just dirt or decayed mortar, but something denser, more industrial in appearance. Marcus began clearing the surrounding soil carefully, using the trowel and his hands. The clay resisted him, compacted and heavy, as though it had been pressed into place rather than deposited by erosion. Each inch he uncovered confirmed the same unsettling truth. This roof extended far beyond the small section he had initially exposed. The tiles continued in neat rows, disappearing beneath the earth on all sides. He widened the trench, moving outward rather than deeper, cautious of undermining whatever lay below. The more he uncovered, the clearer the shape became. This was not debris or a partial structure. The slope was consistent, the angle deliberate, suggesting a full roof rather than a fragment. Marcus paused frequently, measuring with his eyes, tracing imaginary lines where walls would descend. As he worked, he noticed details that erased his last doubts. Near one edge, the tile pattern changed slightly, forming a straight border that looked very much like a roof line. Just beyond it, buried deeper, he found a curved piece of metal coated in rust. When he cleared it further, it revealed itself as a part of a gutter, crushed under the weight of the soil but still recognizable. His pulse quickened. A gutter meant this roof had once been exposed to the open air. It had been part of a functioning building designed to carry rainwater away. The realization carried with it a sense of intrusion, as though he were uncovering something that had been deliberately hidden and expected to remain that way. Marcus stood and stepped back, wiping mud from his gloves. The hole in his yard now looked less like a trench and more like the beginning of an excavation site. He scanned the surrounding ground, looking for cracks or shifts, alert to any sign that the earth might give way. The last thing he wanted was a collapse that could trap him or damage his own house. He reinforced the edges of the trench with scrap boards from the shed, angling them outward to reduce the risk of a cave-in. The practical measures calmed him, grounding his thoughts in familiar routines. Still, beneath that surface calm, questions pressed in relentlessly. How long had this been here? Why had no record of it surfaced when he bought the property? And most troubling of all, how much of it lay beneath his feet? As the sun climbed higher, he returned to digging, this time following the roof's slope downward. The soil grew denser the farther he went, requiring more force to remove. The uniformity of it was striking, as if layers had been added intentionally rather than allowed to settle naturally. In places, thin sheets of plastic-like material appeared between the earth and the tiles, brittle with age but unmistakably artificial. The deeper he dug, the more conscious Marcus became of the weight above whatever space might exist below. He imagined empty rooms, sealed off and bearing the pressure of tons of earth. The thought made him slow his movements, testing each section before committing to further excavation. After several hours, he uncovered a section where the roof met a vertical surface. He cleared soil away gently, revealing the top of a wall. It was made of poured concrete, smooth and uncracked, extending downward beyond the reach of his tools. This was no crude cellar. It was engineered, built to endure. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. A concrete wall beneath a tiled roof suggested a complete structure, not a temporary shelter or makeshift storage space. The craftsmanship implied planning, resources, and intent. Someone had built this with purpose, then gone to considerable effort to bury it. He sat back on the edge of the trench, breathing slowly. The rational part of his mind insisted on caution. This was beyond the scope of a homeowner's project. There could be hazards he could not see, legal implications he did not understand. Yet another part of him, equally strong, pushed him forward. He had uncovered the edge of a story that demanded to be told, and turning away now felt impossible. By midday, the trench had grown large enough that Marcus could clearly see the outline of the roof. It stretched wider than he had expected, extending beneath the lawn toward the tree line. The scale of it made his own house feel suddenly temporary, as if it were merely the topmost layer of something far older and more enduring. He took photographs from multiple angles, documenting every detail he could see. The images felt inadequate, flattening the depth and strangeness of the discovery into something that looked almost ordinary on a screen. Still, he knew he would need them. Evidence, context, proof for others who might doubt his account. At one point, as he cleared soil near what he believed to be a corner, a section of earth collapsed inward with a soft, heavy sound. Marcus froze, heart pounding, then leaned forward cautiously. The collapse had exposed a narrow gap between the roof and the surrounding soil, a dark line that swallowed light. He held his breath, listening for further movement. None came. Carefully, he widened the opening just enough to peer inside with a flashlight. The beam slid across the surface below, revealing the underside of the roof structure. Wooden beams ran parallel to one another, intact and surprisingly dry. Dust drifted in the light, undisturbed for what must have been decades. The sight confirmed what he already knew, but had not fully accepted. There was space beneath this roof. There was a building under his yard. Marcus straightened slowly, his back aching, his hands trembling slightly despite himself. The discovery carried with it a weight that pressed down on him from all sides. This was no longer a question of curiosity. It was a responsibility. Whatever lay below had been hidden deliberately, and now it had been found. He covered the exposed area again, this time more carefully, reinforcing the tarp and marking the ground with stakes to keep himself from forgetting the exact dimensions. As he stood there, looking out over the yard, he realized that the storm had not merely damaged his property. It had peeled back a layer of time, revealing something that had been waiting patiently beneath the surface. That evening, as the light faded once more, Marcus felt the subtle shift in his understanding of the place he called home. The yard was no longer just a patch of grass and soil. It was a threshold, and beyond it lay something vast, silent, and undeniably human in its design, waiting for the next decision he would make. The morning after Marcus confirmed the presence of space beneath the roof, the yard felt different to him, as though it had crossed an invisible line. What had once been familiar ground now carried an unspoken tension. Every step he took across the grass came with the awareness that there was something substantial below, something that had endured unseen while seasons passed and ownership changed. He did not rush into action. Experience had taught him that haste created mistakes, and mistakes, when heavy earth and unknown structures were involved, could turn dangerous quickly. Instead, he spent the early hours assessing the site again, walking the perimeter of the marked area, studying how the soil had shifted since the previous evening. Nothing dramatic had changed, but the ground around the trench felt firmer now that the surface moisture had begun to evaporate. The smell of wet clay still lingered, though fainter, replaced gradually by the dry scent of dust. Marcus knew that continuing by hand would take weeks and increase the risk of collapse. The roof extended far beyond what he could reasonably uncover alone, and the concrete wall he had exposed suggested depth and complexity. Whatever lay beneath was large, and it had been built to last. To understand it properly, he needed machinery, but machinery brought its own complications. This was still his home, his property, and the thought of tearing up the yard with an excavator filled him with reluctant resolve rather than excitement. By late morning, arrangements were made. A small excavator arrived shortly after noon, its engine rumbling softly as it rolled onto the edge of the lawn. Marcus guided the operator carefully, explaining what he had already uncovered and where he believed the structure extended. He insisted on slow, controlled movements, removing soil layer by layer rather than digging aggressively. The operator, sensing the unusual nature of the job, complied without argument. As the machine's bucket began lifting earth away, the scale of the buried structure became immediately apparent. Large sections of soil peeled back cleanly, revealing more of the roof beneath. From this vantage point, the tile pattern appeared almost pristine, the rows straight and evenly spaced. The tiles were not fragile, brittle remnants of a forgotten building. They were heavy, durable, designed to withstand far more than ordinary exposure to weather. Marcus watched closely as the excavator traced the slope of the roof. Each pass revealed more detail. The seams between tiles were sealed with a hardened compound that had not crumbled despite decades underground. In several places, thin sheets of material appeared between the roof and the soil, layered deliberately as a barrier. The operator paused while Marcus examined one of these sheets more closely. It crumbled at the edges, but retained enough integrity to suggest it had once been flexible, likely installed to prevent moisture from penetrating the structure. The presence of such measures unsettled Marcus more than the size of the roof itself. This was not a building that had simply been abandoned and forgotten. Someone had gone to considerable effort to protect it even after it was buried. As the excavation widened, the edges of the roof became clearer. Marcus could now see where it ended and where the walls descended beneath it. The concrete wall he had previously exposed continued downward in a straight, uninterrupted line. There were no cracks, no signs of collapse or pressure damage. The structure had held its shape perfectly under the weight of the earth above. The excavator shifted position, removing soil from another angle, and this time it revealed a rectangular outline where the roof flattened briefly before angling again. Marcus immediately recognized this as a structural feature rather than a flaw. It looked like the sealed opening of a chimney or ventilation shaft, though no opening remained. Instead, it had been capped and covered as carefully as the rest of the roof. As more soil came away, Marcus noticed an increasing number of unusual details in the surrounding earth. There were layers of compacted gravel beneath the soil, forming a stable base that prevented water from pooling against the structure. In some areas, the soil composition changed abruptly, transitioning from local clay to imported fill. The differences were subtle but unmistakable to anyone who had spent time working with land. The realization grew heavier with every passing hour. This structure had not been buried by accident. It had not been swallowed by a landslide or covered by decades of neglect. It had been intentionally concealed, layer by layer, using materials and techniques that suggested planning, knowledge, and significant resources. The excavator operator cut the engine at Marcus's request when the bucket struck something solid that did not match the texture of concrete or stone. Marcus approached cautiously, brushing away loose dirt to reveal a thick metal surface. It was flat, reinforced, and marked with corrosion that suggested long-term exposure to moisture, despite the protective layers above it. The metal was not part of the roof. It sat vertically, partially embedded in the concrete wall, with hinges visible along one side. Marcus felt his breath catch as the shape became clear. This was a hatch, heavy and industrial in design, utterly out of place beneath what appeared to be a residential structure. He knelt beside it, running his fingers along the edge where metal met concrete. The seam was tight, sealed with a compound similar to that used on the roof tiles. A rusted locking mechanism protruded from the center, its padlock fused shut by time. The hatch bore faint markings, not words, but numbers and lines etched into the surface, nearly obscured by corrosion. Marcus straightened slowly, his thoughts racing. A metal hatch beneath a buried house was not something that fit any benign explanation he could think of. This was not simply a forgotten home. This was a place that had been designed to close itself off completely from the world above. The operator stepped back, sensing the gravity of the discovery. Marcus instructed him to stop work for the day. There was too much uncertainty now to continue blindly. The risk of damaging something important or dangerous was real, and Marcus needed time to process what he was uncovering. As the machine was moved away and the site secured once again, Marcus walked the perimeter of the excavation, committing every detail to memory. From above, the exposed structure looked like a fossil embedded in the earth, a preserved remnant of a decision made long ago. The roof stretched wider than he had initially believed, extending beneath a portion of the yard he had never given a second thought to. The walls descended straight and true, disappearing into darkness where the soil still clung to them. That evening, standing at the edge of the excavation, Marcus felt a growing sense of unease. The house he had purchased 5 years earlier now felt like a thin layer atop something far older and more deliberate. He wondered how many times he had walked across this yard without knowing what lay beneath. How many storms had passed without revealing the secret hidden below. The presence of the hatch lingered in his thoughts as night fell. Its industrial design suggested preparation for isolation, for sealing oneself away. The idea carried implications that reached far beyond curiosity. Whoever built this place had expected a reason to disappear underground, and they had prepared accordingly. Marcus returned inside as darkness settled over the yard, locking the door behind him out of habit more than necessity. Sleep came slowly, disturbed by images of concrete walls and sealed metal doors. The structure beneath his yard was no longer just an anomaly. It was a purpose-built space, preserved with care, and it demanded answers that he was no longer willing to postpone. Marcus spent the night turning over the image of the metal hatch in his mind. The roof, the concrete walls, and now this sealed entrance formed a picture that refused to settle into anything familiar. By morning, the unease had hardened into resolve. He understood clearly that whatever lay beneath his yard could not remain half-exposed and unexplored. Leaving it as it was meant accepting uncertainty, and uncertainty was something he had never tolerated well. He approached the site slowly, as though the structure itself might react to his presence. The excavation looked larger in the morning light, the exposed roof pale against the darker soil around it. The hatch sat embedded in the concrete wall like an eye half opened, its rusted surface catching the sun in dull flashes. Marcus paused at the edge of the pit, listening. There was no sound from below, no shift in earth, no hollow echo, just stillness. Before attempting anything else, he focused on safety. He fetched a sturdy ladder from the garage and secured it at the edge of the excavation, anchoring it with rope. He gathered protective gear he had not expected to need when he first picked up a shovel days earlier. A respirator mask, thick gloves, a hard hat left over from a renovation project years ago. He tested his flashlight, then a second one, making sure both beams were strong and reliable. He also brought a length of rope, coiling it neatly and fixing one end to a metal post driven into the ground near the trench. The hatch itself resisted at first. The padlock was fused shut, its surface rough with corrosion. Marcus tried working it loose by hand, then with tools, but it did not budge. He hesitated, considering the implications of forcing it open. This barrier had been designed to keep something out, or something in. Either way, breaking it felt like crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. In the end, practicality won. Using a grinder, borrowed from a neighbor, he cut through the lock carefully, the sound sharp and intrusive against the quiet yard. Sparks flew briefly, then died as the metal gave way. The lock fell to the ground with a dull thud. Marcus stood still for a moment afterward, breathing slowly, waiting for some reaction that never came. He gripped the hatch and pulled. At first it resisted, the seal holding fast after years underground. Then, with a low groan of strained metal, it shifted inward. A breath of air rose from the opening, dry and stale, carrying the faint scent of dust and old wood. Marcus stepped back instinctively, allowing the air to circulate before leaning closer. He shone his flashlight into the darkness beyond the hatch. The beam revealed the top of a ladder descending straight down into the structure. The rungs were metal, bolted securely into the concrete wall, their surfaces dulled but intact. The shaft itself was narrow, designed for purpose rather than comfort. Marcus tested the ladder with one foot, applying weight cautiously. It held. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, secured the rope around his waist, and began to descend. The light from above faded quickly as he moved downward. The concrete walls closed in around him, smooth and cold, bearing no graffiti or markings beyond faint lines where forms had once been removed. His boots echoed softly on the rungs, each step measured and deliberate. The air grew cooler as he descended, but not damp. That, more than anything, surprised him. When his boots finally touched solid ground, Marcus paused, listening again. The silence below was complete, heavy in a way that felt unnatural. He swept the flashlight beam across the floor, revealing a smooth concrete surface free of debris. There were no signs of collapse, no water intrusion. The structure had held perfectly. He moved forward slowly, the beam of light revealing more of the interior with each step. The shaft opened into a larger space, and as the walls fell away, Marcus found himself standing at the threshold of a room that looked disturbingly ordinary. The first thing he noticed was the furniture. A sofa sat against one wall, its fabric faded but intact. A wooden coffee table stood in front of it, a stack of magazines arranged neatly at one corner. A standing lamp rose beside the sofa, its shade yellowed with age but still upright. Everything was coated in a thin layer of dust, yet nothing appeared damaged or disturbed. Marcus felt his breath catch. This was not an abandoned bunker stripped bare by time or scavengers. This was a living space, preserved exactly as it had been left. He stepped further inside, his light drifting across the room. Framed photographs hung on the walls, their images obscured by dust, but still recognizable as family portraits. A bookshelf stood nearby, filled with volumes that looked untouched, their spines unbroken. On one wall, faint rectangles marked where other pictures or decorations had once hung, removed deliberately rather than torn away. The air smelled faintly of paper and old fabric, a dry, archival scent that belonged more in a library than underground. Marcus ran a gloved hand across the back of the sofa, leaving a clean line through the dust. The fabric beneath was firm, not rotted. Time, it seemed, had been held at bay here. He moved into what was clearly a kitchen area. Cabinets lined the walls, their doors closed. A small table stood near one corner, two chairs tucked beneath it. On the countertop sat a ceramic bowl filled with objects that made his stomach tighten. Keys, loose change, a folded piece of paper. Items set down casually, never retrieved. He opened one cabinet carefully. Inside were neatly stacked dishes, their patterns dated but intact. Another cabinet held glass jars, some empty, others containing the dry remnants of what had once been food. Labels clung to them, handwritten and faded. There was no sign of spoilage, no smell of decay. The environment had remained remarkably stable. Marcus became acutely aware of the sensation that accompanied each step he took. It felt as though he were moving through a moment frozen mid-breath. There was no chaos here, no evidence of panic or destruction. Instead, everything suggested a sudden but orderly departure, as though the occupants had believed they would return. He followed a hallway leading away from the main living area. Doors lined either side, all closed. He opened the first cautiously, revealing a bedroom. The bed was made, the blanket smoothed flat. A dresser stood against the wall, its surface holding a few personal items, a watch, a book, a small box. A chair in the corner held a jacket draped over its back, sleeves hanging limply. The second room was smaller. As Marcus swept his light across it, he recognized it immediately as a child's bedroom. Toys lay arranged on a shelf, not scattered but placed with care. A small desk stood near the wall, a notebook resting open on its surface. Crayon drawings were pinned neatly above it, their colors muted but still visible. The sight struck him harder than anything else he had seen. The presence of a child transformed the structure from an oddity into a deeply human space. This had not been a shelter built solely for survival. It had been a home. Marcus backed out into the hallway, his thoughts racing. Questions crowded his mind, each more unsettling than the last. Who had lived here? Why had they chosen to build underground? And why had they left everything behind? At the end of the hallway, he found another door, heavier than the rest. Its frame was reinforced, the wood thicker, the hinges larger. This door was locked. Marcus tested it gently, then more firmly. It did not move. He stood there for a long moment, the beam of his flashlight steady on the door. The structure beneath his yard was already far more than he had imagined. The locked door suggested there was more still, something separate from the domestic spaces he had seen so far. Reluctantly, he turned back toward the ladder. The weight of what he had discovered pressed down on him with every step. When he climbed back into the daylight, the ordinary world felt strangely thin, as though it were the illusion and the buried house the reality. Marcus sealed the hatch again as best he could, covering it securely before leaving the site. As he walked back toward his house, he understood with absolute clarity that he had crossed a threshold. The discovery beneath his yard was not merely architectural or historical. It was a life paused mid-motion, waiting for someone to acknowledge it. That night, as he lay awake once more, the image of the locked door at the end of the hallway refused to leave him. Whatever lay beyond it, he knew, would explain why this house had been hidden, and why time itself seemed to have stopped within its walls. Marcus did not return underground immediately the next morning. The images from the previous descent lingered too vividly in his mind. The made bed, the jacket on the chair, the child's drawings pinned with quiet care. Those details had transformed the structure from an architectural mystery into something far more intimate. He needed distance before he could enter that space again with clarity rather than shock. He spent the early hours above ground, walking the yard and the interior of his own house, grounding himself in the familiar. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the stairs, the sunlight moving slowly across the living room floor all felt unusually fragile, as though they existed on a thin surface layer above another, deeper reality. Beneath him lay a home that had not aged in the same way, a place where time had folded in on itself and then stopped. By late morning, Marcus felt ready. He gathered his equipment again, adding a notebook and camera this time. Instinct told him that what he was about to see deserved careful documentation, not just memory. When he reopened the hatch and descended the ladder, the cool, dry air welcomed him back with the same stillness as before. Nothing had shifted overnight. The silence remained complete. He entered the main living area and paused, letting his eyes adjust. In the daylight that filtered faintly down the shaft behind him, the room seemed even more like a preserved photograph. Dust lay undisturbed on every surface, unmarked by footprints except his own from the night before. The sofa cushions were slightly indented, as though someone had once risen from them and never returned. The magazines on the coffee table were dated, their covers announcing events that belonged to another era, their pages yellowed but intact. Marcus moved slowly, deliberately, treating the space with a kind of reverence. He resisted the urge to touch everything at once, focusing instead on understanding the layout. The house followed a conventional design, nothing experimental or bunker-like in its arrangement. It had been built to feel normal, comfortable, familiar. That, he realized, was what made it so unsettling. In the kitchen, he examined the countertop more closely. The folded piece of paper in the ceramic bowl caught his attention. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a grocery list written in a neat, practiced hand. The items were mundane, ordinary, the kind of list anyone might jot down without thinking. There was no hint of urgency, no sign that it had been written as part of a final act. It was simply unfinished. He opened drawers and cabinets with care, noting their contents. Cooking utensils hung neatly, their handles worn smooth from use. A calendar hung on the wall near the refrigerator, its pages turned to a specific month and then left there. Marcus noted the year, committing it to memory. It placed the last known moment of normal life in this house firmly in the past, but not so distant as to feel ancient. Moving down the hallway again, he entered the bedroom he had seen briefly the night before. In the clearer light of a stronger flashlight, details emerged that he had missed. Photographs on the dresser showed a family, a man and woman standing close together, a child between them, smiling at the camera. Their faces were clear, unremarkable in the way that made them feel more real. These were not people who had expected to become a mystery. Marcus picked up the watch from the dresser, turning it gently in his hand. The glass was scratched, the band worn soft with age. When he wound it slightly, the second hand twitched, then began to move. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. The watch still worked. He set it down carefully, a chill running through him. The realization that objects here were not merely preserved, but functional, deepened his sense that this place existed outside normal time. It was not a ruin. It was a pause. In the smaller bedroom, the child's presence felt even stronger in the daylight. The notebook on the desk contained half-finished drawings and simple writing exercises. Pages were dog-eared, corners folded and unfolded repeatedly. A backpack hung from a hook on the wall, its contents neatly arranged. Nothing suggested abandonment through force or panic. Everything suggested departure with the expectation of return. Marcus found clothing folded in drawers, shoes lined neatly along the base of the closet. In one corner, a small box held keepsakes, a ribbon, a broken toy car, a few coins from different years. He closed the box slowly, aware that he was looking at the fragments of a life interrupted without explanation. The bathroom, too, reinforced that impression. Towels hung neatly, toiletries were arranged with care. There was no sign of decay or neglect. Even the mirror, though dulled slightly at the edges, reflected his face clearly as he stood there, a stranger intruding into a space that had not consented to be reopened. As he continued exploring, Marcus began to notice subtler details that hinted at intention rather than accident. Some windows, though fully buried, had been reinforced from the inside with additional framing. Vents had been sealed carefully, not crudely blocked. In a storage closet, he found sealed containers stacked against one wall, their lids tight, their contents labeled with dates. The labels were precise, methodical. The deeper he went, the clearer it became that whoever had lived here had anticipated a prolonged separation from the surface world. This was not simply a house that had been buried, it was a house that had been prepared to endure burial. Marcus's attention returned repeatedly to the locked door at the end of the hallway. He did not open it yet, but its presence shaped his movements, a constant reminder that there was more to uncover. For now, he focused on gathering context. In a small, office-like space near the living area, he found a filing cabinet. Inside were documents carefully arranged, their edges aligned, their contents dry and legible. Deeds, insurance papers, correspondence. As Marcus flipped through them, a picture began to form. The names on the documents matched those in the photographs. This house had belonged to a single family, and they had been meticulous record keepers. Yet something was missing. There were gaps in the timeline, periods where documents should have existed but did not. It was as if portions of their life had been deliberately removed. The last dated papers ended abruptly without explanation. There was no record of sale, no transfer, no official acknowledgement of departure. Marcus sat on the edge of the sofa, notebook in hand, trying to make sense of what he had seen. The house was full of life, yet utterly devoid of people. It had not been looted, vandalized, or forgotten by chance. It had been sealed, preserved, and left behind as though its occupants believed it would one day be found exactly as it was. The realization carried a quiet weight. This was not a tragedy marked by chaos. It was something colder, more deliberate, a choice. As he stood to leave, Marcus glanced once more down the hallway, his eyes drawn again to the reinforced door at the far end. The rooms he had explored told a story of normalcy and care, but they did not explain why that normal life had been buried. Whatever answer existed lay beyond that door. When he climbed back to the surface, the afternoon sun felt harsh and intrusive. The yard looked unchanged, peaceful, betraying none of the complexity hidden beneath. Marcus covered the hatch again, securing it carefully, and stood for a long moment, staring at the ground. He understood now that the house beneath his yard was not merely a curiosity or a historical anomaly. It was the preserved echo of a family's decision, one that had erased them from the surface world while leaving their lives intact below. And until he understood why they had chosen that path, the discovery would remain incomplete, a story suspended between what was seen and what was still locked away. After the fifth descent underground, Marcus understood that observation alone would no longer be enough. The rooms, the objects, the carefully preserved fragments of domestic life had given him atmosphere and emotion, but they had not given him explanation. The deeper truth of the buried house lay somewhere beyond furniture and photographs. It lived in records, in absences, in the quiet contradictions between what clearly existed beneath his yard and what, according to the surface world, had never been there at all. For the first time since the discovery, Marcus forced himself to stay above ground for an entire day. He needed perspective, and he needed information that could not be found underground. The house beneath the yard was sealed in time, but the world above it was not, and it held the keys to understanding why such a place could be built, inhabited, and then erased. He began with his own paperwork. The folder containing the purchase documents for his home had not been opened in years. He spread everything out across the dining table: the deed, the survey maps, zoning records, inspection reports. He examined them slowly, not skimming, but reading with the same attention he had given to the documents found underground. The property lines were clearly defined, the history summarized in neat blocks of typed text. According to these records, the land had been undeveloped until the late stages of the subdivision project. There was no mention of an earlier residence, no notation of demolition, no reference to prior structures of any kind. That absence was not ambiguous. It was absolute. Marcus compared the official survey map to the physical reality of his yard. The measurements did not lie. The buried house sat squarely within his property boundaries, directly beneath land described in the records as untouched soil prior to modern construction. The contradiction was not subtle. One of the two realities had to be false, and the structure beneath his feet was far too deliberate, too complete to be dismissed as illusion. He moved outward from his own documents to public records. Over the next several days, Marcus visited municipal offices, county archives, and online databases, careful to ask neutral questions that did not immediately raise alarm. He searched for building permits, demolition records, historical aerial photographs, zoning changes. He expected resistance or missing files, But what he found was something stranger. The records were clean. Too clean. The subdivision history showed a smooth progression from undeveloped land to planned residential lots. There were no gaps, no anomalies, no notes indicating disputes or alterations. Even the oldest aerial photographs available showed open ground where the buried house should have been. Yet Marcus now knew how misleading that evidence could be. A structure buried deliberately, with soil graded and vegetation restored, could disappear even from aerial view given enough care and time. He expanded his search. Old tax records showed that the land had been assessed as agricultural property decades earlier, then abruptly reclassified. Ownership during that transition period passed through a holding company whose name appeared only briefly in the records before dissolving. There was no detailed explanation of the company's purpose, no list of assets beyond land transactions. Marcus copied the name into his notebook, circling it. It was the first concrete irregularity he had found above ground. At home, he laid out the documents retrieved from the underground filing cabinet beside the official records. The contrast was striking. The underground documents were personal, specific, filled with names, dates, signatures. The official records were abstract, sanitized, stripped of human presence. The two sets of papers described the same land in incompatible ways. As Marcus studied them side by side, a timeline began to form. The family who had lived underground had owned the property long before the subdivision existed. Their documents referenced improvements, maintenance, insurance policies tied to a structure that, according to the official version of events, had never stood there. At some point, those references stopped abruptly. After that date, the family vanished from public record entirely. Marcus returned to the yard with fresh eyes. He walked its perimeter slowly, looking not for what was visible, but for what might have been altered. Near the tree line, he noticed subtle changes in elevation that he had once dismissed as natural variation. Now they looked intentional, as though soil had been moved and leveled in broad, careful strokes. Old fence posts, long rotted and barely visible at ground level, marked a boundary that no longer existed on any map. He found remnants of stone, partially buried beneath grass near the edge of the property, arranged in a way that suggested a former walkway or foundation edge. Each discovery reinforced the same conclusion. The land had been reshaped, not merely developed. Returning underground, Marcus focused his attention on the documents he had previously skimmed. This time he read every line. Letters between institutions, notices of disputes, insurance correspondence that hinted at risk assessments and liability concerns. The language was formal, restrained, but beneath it lay tension. There were references to structural considerations and containment measures that made little sense in the context of a normal residence. One document, dated only months before the last known activity in the house, caught his attention. It referenced an inspection that had been conducted privately rather than through municipal channels. The inspector's name appeared nowhere in public records. The recommendations listed were vague but alarming, emphasizing discretion and long-term planning. Marcus closed the folder slowly. The picture emerging was no longer simply about a family choosing to live underground. It was about pressure applied from outside, about decisions made under circumstances that had never been recorded officially. The locked door at the end of the hallway took on new significance in his mind. Until now, he had seen it as a physical barrier. Now, it felt like a line dividing two narratives. On one side lay the life the family had lived openly, reflected in furniture, toys, and photographs. On the other side lay the reason that life had been buried. Marcus delayed opening the door for another day, not out of fear, but out of respect for the process. He wanted to be certain that when he crossed that threshold, he would recognize what he was seeing for what it truly was. That evening, he reviewed his notes one last time. Names, dates, company references, unexplained gaps. Everything pointed to a coordinated effort to remove a structure from history without leaving obvious scars. That kind of erasure required authority, resources, and motive. Standing in his kitchen, the ordinary sounds of his own house around him, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle fully onto his shoulders. He was no longer merely a homeowner who had stumbled upon a hidden space. He was the only witness to a deliberate disappearance, one that had succeeded so completely that the truth had survived only underground. The next step was unavoidable. The locked door was not just another room. It was the boundary between what had been allowed to remain visible and what had been intentionally concealed. Whatever lay beyond it would explain why a family's home had been buried, why official records denied its existence, and why time itself seemed to have been carefully folded over this place. When Marcus finally returned underground that night, standing once more at the end of the hallway, he no longer felt like an intruder. He felt like an archivist on the edge of a sealed chapter, about to read words that someone had gone to great lengths to keep unread. Marcus stood in the hallway longer than he realized, the beam of his flashlight resting steadily on the reinforced door at the far end. Everything he had learned above ground had narrowed his focus to this single point. The documents, the erased records, the deliberate reshaping of the land all converged here. The house itself had told him how people lived. This door would tell him why that life had been hidden. He did not rush. He checked his equipment again with methodical care, more careful now than during any previous descent. He adjusted the respirator, tested the flashlight batteries, secured the rope at his waist. The quiet discipline of preparation calmed him, allowing his thoughts to settle into something precise and controlled. He was no longer reacting to discovery. He was conducting an examination. The door was heavier up close than it had appeared from a distance. The wood was thick, reinforced with a steel plate on the inner side, the hinges bolted directly into concrete. This was not a door meant to provide privacy or comfort. It was meant to separate, to isolate. The lock was mechanical, old-fashioned but robust, its mechanism protected by metal housing designed to resist tampering. Marcus tried the handle once more, though he knew it would not open. It held firm. He knelt and examined the lock closely, comparing it to the keys he had found elsewhere in the house. One of them matched the shape precisely. The realization sent a slow chill through him. The family had not simply sealed this room and walked away. They had taken the key with them, deliberately leaving this space inaccessible even to themselves unless absolutely necessary. He inserted the key and turned it carefully. The mechanism resisted at first, then yielded with a muted click that echoed softly down the hallway. Marcus held his breath, listening. Nothing followed. No rush of air, no sound from within. He pulled the door toward him and it opened slowly, the hinges moving with a low, controlled groan. The room beyond was darker than any space he had yet seen underground. The air felt heavier, carrying a faint metallic scent beneath the dryness. Marcus swept the flashlight beam across the threshold, revealing a space that was immediately different in character from the rest of the house. This was not a live-in area. It was functional, deliberate, and stripped of anything unnecessary. Metal shelving lined the walls, bolted directly into concrete. On them sat sealed containers of various sizes, all labeled in the same careful handwriting he had seen on the food storage upstairs. Unlike the domestic supplies, however, these labels referenced dates, quantities, and classifications rather than simple contents. The precision was unmistakable. At the center of the room stood a large metal cabinet, its surface marked with scratches and signs of use. Beside it was a reinforced table, bare except for a few neatly arranged folders. Marcus approached slowly, his footsteps sounding louder here, sharper against the concrete floor. He opened the first folder and began to read. The documents inside were different from anything he had seen so far. They were not personal letters or household records. They were reports, assessments, correspondence between entities that did not appear in any public archive Marcus had accessed. The language was technical, restrained, but unmistakably urgent beneath its formality. As he read, a narrative began to take shape, fragmented at first, then increasingly coherent. The house had not been built underground originally. It had once stood on the surface, an ordinary home in an ordinary place. The decision to bury it came later, driven not by whim or eccentricity, but by pressure. The documents referenced a nearby industrial operation that had existed briefly decades earlier, one that never appeared in official histories. Its purpose was described obliquely, its activities framed as research and testing. What exactly had been tested was never stated outright, but repeated references to containment, exposure risk, and long-term monitoring made the implications clear. The land beneath the house had been identified as compromised. Marcus felt a tightening in his chest as he continued reading. The family who lived here had been informed that remaining above ground carried risks that could not be publicly disclosed. Evacuation had been suggested, then quietly discouraged. Instead, a solution had been proposed, one that would allow the issue to be managed without attracting attention. The house would be reinforced. Then it would be buried. In exchange, the family would receive compensation, protection, and the assurance that the issue would be resolved over time. The arrangement was never formalized in public record. Everything was handled through private channels, sealed agreements, and temporary corporate entities that could later be dissolved without trace. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of what he was reading. The buried house was not an act of fear, it was an act of containment. He moved deeper into the room, opening the metal cabinet. Inside were instruments carefully packed away, their designs unfamiliar but clearly specialized. Measuring devices, sealed sampling containers, protective equipment. Everything suggested long-term monitoring rather than immediate danger. This had been a slow problem, one expected to persist quietly over years rather than explode into crisis. One shelf held a series of journals. Marcus lifted the first one and opened it gently. Unlike the official documents, these were personal. The handwriting was tight and controlled, the tone measured. The writer documented daily life underground, the routines, the adjustments, the psychological strain of living sealed away from the surface world. The entries spoke of hope at first, the belief that this was temporary, that the situation would be resolved and life could return to normal. Over time, that hope faded, replaced by resignation and careful planning. The family adapted, creating a semblance of normalcy for the child, maintaining routines, preserving a sense of order. Then, abruptly, the tone shifted. The final entries described a change in communication from the outside. Fewer updates, missed appointments, reassurances that felt increasingly hollow. The family began to suspect that the solution they had been promised was no longer a priority. The last entry ended mid-sentence. Marcus set the journal down slowly, his hands steady but his mind racing. The family had not vanished because they chose isolation. They had been isolated, managed, and ultimately abandoned by a system that found it easier to erase a problem than to resolve it publicly. He searched the rest of the room carefully, documenting everything he found. In a corner behind one of the shelves, he discovered a secondary access panel built into the floor. It led to a deeper cavity beneath the house, one that contained sealed barrels and monitoring equipment embedded directly into the earth. Marcus did not open them. He did not need to. Their presence alone explained the urgency, the secrecy, the erasure. When he finally stepped back into the hallway, closing the reinforced door behind him, the domestic spaces of the house felt profoundly altered. The living room, the kitchen, the child's bedroom were no longer just remnants of a vanished life. They were evidence of endurance under impossible circumstances. Marcus climbed the ladder to the surface with a heaviness that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The evening light greeted him warmly, the yard unchanged, birds calling from the trees as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened there. The contrast felt almost cruel. Standing at the edge of the excavation, Marcus understood fully now why the house had been buried. It was not to hide a family from the world, but to hide the world from a mistake that could not be undone without consequence. The land had been contaminated, compromised in a way that demanded silence. The family had lived their lives underground so that no one else would have to know. As he covered the hatch once more, securing it with care, Marcus felt the weight of the final question settle in his mind. The family had disappeared not because the house was buried, but because at some point they had left. Where they went, and what became of them after abandoning this sealed refuge, remained unknown. But Marcus knew one thing with certainty. The buried house was not the end of the story. It was the proof of a truth that had been carefully concealed, waiting for someone willing to look beneath the surface and refuse to let it be buried again. The morning after Marcus closed the reinforced door for the last time, he woke with a clarity that surprised him. The confusion and disbelief that had accompanied the discovery were gone, replaced by a sober understanding of what the buried house represented. It was no longer simply a mystery uncovered by chance. It was evidence. And evidence, once recognized, demanded response. The yard looked unchanged in the early light. Dew clung to the grass, the excavation carefully secured and partially concealed beneath tarps and temporary barriers. To any passerby, it was still just a quiet suburban property, recovering from a storm. Yet Marcus knew that beneath that calm surface lay a structure that contradicted official history and carried consequences far beyond his own property line. He spent the first hours of the day documenting everything again, more thoroughly than before. He photographed the exposed sections of roof, the concrete walls, the hatch, and the ladder shaft. He reviewed his notes from the sealed room, organizing them into a coherent timeline. Names, dates, corporate entities, technical references, all aligned now into a narrative that was no longer fragmented. It told a story of compromise, containment, and silence. By midday, Marcus made the decision he had been circling for days. He contacted independent experts rather than authorities bound to existing institutional interests. Structural engineers, environmental specialists, and a legal consultant with experience in historical land disputes. He was careful in how he described the discovery, offering facts without interpretation, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. The first expert arrived 2 days later. The engineer examined the exposed structure with professional detachment, but Marcus noticed the shift in his demeanor as the scope of the buried house became clear. Measurements were taken, materials assessed, construction techniques analyzed. The verdict was unambiguous. This was not an amateur project or an eccentric modification. It was a professionally engineered structure designed to endure both burial and long-term isolation. The environmental specialist followed. Samples were taken carefully from the deeper access point Marcus had discovered but not disturbed. The results, delivered days later, confirmed what the documents had implied. The soil beneath the house carried traces of industrial contamination consistent with mid-century experimental processes. The levels were not immediately hazardous at the surface, which explained why modern development had proceeded without incident. But beneath the house, the contamination persisted, contained but unresolved. The implications were sobering. The buried house had functioned as both a home and a buffer, an improvised solution that allowed a problem to remain hidden until time itself reduced its urgency. Or so someone had hoped. As word spread quietly among the professionals Marcus had involved, the tone shifted from curiosity to caution. Legal questions surfaced immediately. Who bore responsibility for what lay beneath the property? Who had authorized the burial of a residential structure without record? And, perhaps most troubling, who had decided that silence was preferable to transparency? Marcus found himself at the center of conversations he had never imagined having. His quiet life as a homeowner dissolved into meetings, reports, and consultations. The house he lived in felt increasingly provisional, as though it too might someday be rendered temporary by forces beyond his control. Yet, amid the growing complexity, one question remained deeply personal. What had become of the family who had lived underground? Marcus returned to the journals from the sealed room, reading them again with fresh eyes. In one entry, buried among routine observations, he noticed a reference he had previously overlooked. A mention of a planned departure, coded in cautious language. The family had prepared an exit, one that did not involve official channels. They had saved resources, secured documents, and planned to leave quietly when it became clear that the promised resolution would never arrive. The final pages suggested that they had succeeded. Marcus cross-referenced names and dates, tracing faint trails through public records outside the region. It took weeks of patient searching, but eventually fragments aligned. A name change here, a relocated address there. The family had resurfaced elsewhere, starting over under altered identities. There were no signs of tragedy, no records of death. They had survived by erasing themselves. The realization brought an unexpected sense of relief. The buried house was not a tomb, it was a testament to endurance and escape. The family had not been consumed by the secrecy imposed upon them. They had outlasted it. As this understanding settled, Marcus faced his final decision. The discovery could be sealed again, quietly managed, its existence acknowledged only through controlled remediation. Or it could be brought fully into the open, forcing accountability for decisions made decades earlier. He chose a measured path between those extremes. Working with his legal advisor, Marcus ensured that the findings were documented in independent archives, protected from easy dismissal. The site was officially designated for controlled study and remediation, removing it from casual development without sensational exposure. The buried house would not become a spectacle, nor would it vanish again. When the process was complete, the yard was restored carefully, the excavation stabilized and secured. Beneath the surface, the house remained, preserved not as a secret, but as a record. Marcus stood one evening at the edge of the property, watching the sun dip behind the trees, aware that his life had been permanently altered by what lay unseen below. He no longer thought of the house as something hidden. It was part of the land's truth, a chapter that had been folded away but not destroyed. And now, finally, it had been read. As he turned back toward his own home, Marcus carried with him a quiet certainty. Some truths do not demand to be shouted. They demand to be preserved, understood, and guarded against being buried again. If this story surprised you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. More hidden discoveries and real stories are coming next. Watch the next video to uncover another secret that was never meant to be found. And if this story shocked you, share it with someone who loves mysteries like this.